fearless mother exposed the truth. Her powerful family tried to silence her. Kathy Wells's hands trembled as she held the damning documents that could destroy her father-in-law's pharmaceutical empire. The evidence of covered-up deaths lay scattered across her kitchen table, while Augustus Wells's voice echoed from her voicemail. "You have 24 hours to burn those papers, or you'll lose everything, including Emma." The doorbell rang. Had he sent someone already? The pristine Wells family estate in Connecticut spoke of 3 generations of pharmaceutical success, but Kathy Wells had learned that some foundations were built on secrets. At 52, she had spent 15 years as the perfect Wells wife, hosting charity galas, supporting Logan's political ambitions, and ensuring their daughter Emma had every advantage their wealth could provide. Yet something about the family's recent nervous energy had begun to unsettle her. The morning sun filtered through the French doors of Augustus Wells's mahogany-paneled study, where Kathy managed the family's charitable foundation with the same meticulous attention she'd once brought to social work. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once fought for vulnerable families from a cramped nonprofit office, and now she distributed the Wells fortune from a room that cost more than most people's homes. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened another foundation application, this one typed on a computer that had clearly seen better days. The letterhead read, "Martinez Family," in simple block letters, followed by a Hartford address she recognized from her social work days, a neighborhood where hope came in small doses and medical bills arrived like monthly hurricanes. "Mrs. Wells," the letter began, "I am writing to request help for my son Diego, who has bone cancer. He is 8 years old and loves to draw pictures of dinosaurs. The doctors say there is a new treatment from your husband's company, but it costs $40,000 every month. We have sold everything we own, but it is not enough. Diego asks me why the medicine that is supposed to help him costs more than our house. I don't know what to tell him." Kathy's throat tightened as she continued reading. Jennifer Martinez had included medical records, test results, and photographs of Diego, a beautiful boy with dark eyes that reminded her of Emma at that age. But it was the final paragraph that made her hands still completely. "Mrs. Wells, Diego has been taking the medicine for 3 months now, and he is getting sicker instead of better. The doctors say this is normal, that we must be patient. But other mothers in the online support group are saying their children also got worse before they didn't get better at all. I don't understand how medicine that costs so much can make children suffer more. Please help us understand what is happening." Something cold settled in Kathy's stomach as she reread the letter. She'd processed hundreds of foundation applications over the years, but none had mentioned children getting worse on Wells pharmaceutical treatments. The family's experimental drugs were supposed to represent cutting-edge hope for the most desperate patients. Augustus had always spoken with such pride about their breakthrough treatments, explaining how Wells Pharmaceutical focused on rare diseases that larger companies ignored. "We help the families that no one else will touch," he'd said during countless dinner conversations. "It's not always profitable, but it's the right thing to do." The first crack in her faith appeared during a foundation meeting 3 weeks earlier when Augustus had dismissed a proposal for pediatric cancer research with unusual sharpness. "We don't fund anything related to childhood cancers," he'd said, his jaw tightening in a way that made Logan quickly change the subject. When Kathy had asked why afterward, Logan had shrugged and mentioned something about avoiding conflicts of interest. Emma bounced into the study with the energy only teenagers possess, backpack slung over one shoulder and her laptop tucked under her arm. At 17, she had inherited her mother's moral compass and her grandfather's sharp intellect, a combination that increasingly led to uncomfortable dinner table conversations. "Mom, can I use Grandpa's computer for my government project? Mine is being weird again." Emma set her laptop on Augustus's desk with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up in privilege but hadn't yet learned to question its sources. "What's your project about?" Kathy asked, grateful for the distraction from Jennifer Martinez's heartbreaking letter. Corporate whistleblowing and regulatory capture. You know, how companies sometimes manipulate government oversight to get away with stuff they shouldn't. Emma's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone discovering how the world actually worked. Did you know that some pharmaceutical companies have paid millions in fines for hiding negative test results? Like, they knew their drugs didn't work or were dangerous, but they sold them anyway because the profits were higher than the penalties. Kathy felt that cold sensation in her stomach intensify. That seems like an unusual topic for a high school project. Mrs. Rodriguez says it's important for our generation to understand how power actually works, not just how it's supposed to work. Emma opened her grandfather's computer and began typing with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up with technology. Look at this case. Pemberton Pharmaceuticals got caught manipulating clinical trial data for a childhood leukemia drug. Kids died because the company buried safety reports that showed the treatment was making patients sicker. The screen filled with court documents, FDA findings, and photographs of children who looked remarkably similar to Diego Martinez. Kathy moved closer, reading over Emma's shoulder as her daughter scrolled, through evidence of systematic pharmaceutical fraud. The crazy part is that families were paying like $30,000 a month for this drug, thinking they were buying their kids more time, Emma continued, her teenage moral clarity cutting through adult rationalizations. But the company knew it was basically selling expensive false hope. How do people sleep at night knowing they're profiting from dead children? Before we see how Kathy's perfect world begins to crumble, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something wasn't right in your family or workplace? Share your story in the comments below and please hit that subscribe button because this story shows how one woman's courage changed everything. Kathy's hands began to shake as she recognized the patterns Emma was describing. The expensive treatments marketed to desperate families, the clinical trials that somehow produced favorable results despite patient testimonials suggesting otherwise, the focus on rare diseases where regulatory oversight was lighter and profit margins higher. Emma, maybe you should choose a different topic, she said carefully, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. Why? This is important stuff, Mom. People need to know how these companies operate. Emma pulled up another case study, this one involving a diabetes medication that had caused liver failure in elderly patients. Besides, understanding pharmaceutical regulation might help with my pre-med applications. I want to be the kind of doctor who actually helps people instead of just making money off their suffering. The idealism in Emma's voice was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Kathy realized her daughter was unknowingly describing the very industry that had funded her privileged upbringing, the same industry that allowed her to attend elite schools and plan for an Ivy League education without financial concerns. That evening at dinner, the 3 generations of Wells' family gathered around the antique mahogany table that had witnessed decades of conversations about business, politics, and the careful management of public reputation. Augustus, at 71, still commanded the room with his silver hair and grandfather demeanor, though Kathy had begun noticing how his pale blue eyes could shift from warm to calculating in the space between heartbeats. Logan, now 45, carried the perpetual tension of someone caught between his father's expectations and his own conscience. He'd confided to Kathy years ago that he'd wanted to be a teacher, but family duty had redirected him toward business school and eventual company leadership. These days, he seemed to age a little more each time Augustus mentioned succession planning. Emma tells me she's researching pharmaceutical regulation for school, Augustus said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. Interesting choice of topic. Mrs. Rodriguez assigned it, Emma replied, missing the subtle warning in her grandfather's tone. I'm learning so much about how companies sometimes manipulate clinical trials and hide negative results from regulators. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken communication between Augustus and Logan. Kathy watched her husband's jaw tighten as he glanced between his father and daughter, clearly calculating how to navigate between them. Well, you should be careful about believing everything you read online, Logan said finally. These cases are often more complex than news articles make them seem. But Dad, I'm not reading news articles. I'm reading actual court documents and FDA reports. Emma's voice carried the patient tone teenagers used when explaining obvious truths to confused adults. Like, there's this one case where a company knew their cancer drug was causing organ failure in children, but they kept selling it because the profit margins were so high. Augustus set down his fork with deliberate control. Emma, these situations involve medical complexities that take years of training to understand. What might look like corporate malfeasance to an outsider could actually be difficult decisions made by people trying to help desperately ill patients. But Grandpa, if children are dying from the treatment instead of the disease, that's enough. Augustus's voice carried the authoritative finality that had ended family discussions for decades. I think you should choose a different topic for your project, something more appropriate for your age and understanding. Emma's eyes flashed with the rebellious fire that reminded Kathy of her own teenage years. Why is it inappropriate to learn about pharmaceutical regulation? Don't you want me to understand how medicine actually works? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Augustus had built his identity around. Kathy watched her father-in-law's face carefully, noting the micro-expressions that revealed his discomfort with his granddaughter's inconvenient moral clarity. I want you to understand that the world is more complicated than your textbooks suggest, Augustus replied, his grandfatherly mask sliding back into place. Some topics are better explored when you have more life experience to provide context. Later that night, after Emma had reluctantly agreed to consider changing her project topic, Kathy found herself unable to sleep. She stood by her bedroom window looking out at the manicured gardens that surrounded their home and wondered when she'd stopped asking the kinds of questions Emma was asking. When had she learned to accept Augustus's explanations without seeking independent verification? When had she begun prioritizing family harmony over her own professional instincts? Most troubling of all, when had she stopped trusting her ability to distinguish between complex medical realities and deliberate deception? The foundation application from Jennifer Martinez lay on her nightstand, a reminder of the question she'd been avoiding. Tomorrow, she decided, she would do something she hadn't done in years. She would investigate independently using the research skills that had once made her an effective social worker. She had no idea that decision would transform not only her own life, but potentially save the lives of countless children whose families were desperate enough to trust a grandfather's gentle smile and pay any price for hope. The Wells pharmaceutical empire had been built on the assumption that comfortable people didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Augustus was about to discover that his daughter-in-law's comfort was becoming very uncomfortable indeed. The foundation application that changed everything came from Jennifer Martinez, but it was Kathy's decision to truly listen to its message that set the catastrophe in motion. The next morning, while Augustus conducted business calls from his study and Logan prepared for another day of managing the family legacy, Kathy made a choice that would echo through generations. She picked up her phone and dialed the number at the bottom of Jennifer Martinez's letter. Mrs. Martinez, this is Kathy Wells from the Wells Foundation. I received your application about Diego, and I'd like to learn more about his treatment experience. The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes and shattered every assumption Kathy had made about her family's business. Jennifer Martinez spoke with the desperate precision of a mother who'd watched her child suffer while spending the family's life savings on medicine that seemed designed to prolong agony rather than provide healing. Mrs. Wells, I kept detailed records because I'm a nurse, and something didn't make sense, Jennifer explained, her voice thick with grief and confusion. Diego's cancer markers improved for 2 weeks after starting the Wells treatment, but then everything got worse fast, much worse than it should have been. What do you mean, worse? The drug was supposed to target his bone cancer, but it started affecting his liver, his kidneys, his heart. The oncologist said these were unexpected side effects and that we should continue treatment because stopping might cause rapid tumor growth. So we kept paying, kept giving Diego medicine that was destroying his organs while his cancer actually spread faster than before treatment. Kathy's hands were shaking as she took notes, her social work training kicking in automatically. Did other families report similar experiences? That's what scared me most. I found an online support group for families using Wells experimental treatments, and it was like reading the same story over and over. Children getting sicker on the medicine, families going bankrupt, doctors saying the side effects were normal, but the timeline kept getting pushed back. Jennifer's voice broke as she continued. Mrs. Wells, Diego died last Tuesday. Not from cancer, but from organ failure caused by your family's treatment. The funeral, director said his liver looked like he'd been poisoned. How is that helping sick children? After hanging up, Kathy sat in the profound silence of her beautiful home and felt the last of her willful ignorance crumble away. Diego Martinez had died not from the disease his family was fighting, but from the cure they'd bankrupted themselves to afford. And if Jennifer was right about the support group, Diego wasn't alone. That afternoon, when Augustus left for his weekly golf game and Logan was safely occupied at the office, Kathy did something she'd never done before. She accessed Augustus's computer without permission, using the password she'd seen him type dozens of times during Foundation meetings. The computer contained what felt like 1,000,000 files, organized with the efficiency of someone who understood the importance of documentation and the equal importance of keeping that documentation private. Kathy started with folders labeled Clinical Trials and FDA Correspondence, her heart hammering as she realized she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The first document she opened was a clinical trial report from 3 years earlier, evaluating the safety and efficacy of the pediatric bone cancer treatment that had killed Diego Martinez. Her medical social work background helped her understand the statistical language, but what she read made her physically nauseous. 73% of children in the trial had experienced significant adverse events within the first month of treatment. 41% had developed organ failure symptoms. 17 children had died during the 6-month trial period, not from cancer progression, but from complications directly attributable to the experimental drug. The trial had been classified as a failure by every medical standard, with recommendations for immediate discontinuation and investigation of the compound's toxicity. Yet somehow, the same drug was now being marketed to desperate families for $40,000 per month. Presented as a breakthrough treatment for childhood bone cancers, Kathy scrolled through page after page of buried safety data, manipulated statistics, and correspondence with regulatory officials that suggested a level of corruption she'd never imagined possible. Augustus hadn't just hidden negative results. He'd systematically falsified clinical trial reports, bribed FDA reviewers, and created an entire shadow system for marketing failed treatments to the most vulnerable patient populations. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Wells Pharmaceutical didn't just focus on rare diseases because they were underserved. They targeted them because regulatory oversight was lighter. Patient populations were desperate, and failed treatments could be remarketed as cutting-edge hope to families with nowhere else to turn. Her hands shook as she read Augustus's handwritten notes in the margins of mortality reports, next to a list of children who died. During a diabetes trial, he'd written acceptable losses, profit margin 340%. Below a report of birth defects caused by a pregnancy supplement, his notation read, discontinue overseas, market domestically to fertility clinics. The cold calculation behind the comments was horrifying, but what truly broke Kathy's heart was recognizing the families behind the statistics. These weren't acceptable losses. They were children like Diego Martinez, parents like Jennifer, who trusted a grandfather's reassuring smile and paid with everything they had for treatments designed to fail. She printed the most damning documents, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the machine. With each page that emerged from Augustus's expensive printer, she felt her comfortable life dissolving piece by piece. The Persian rugs beneath her feet, the imported marble countertops, Emma's elite private school tuition, all of it was paid for with blood money extracted from families facing their worst nightmares. That evening, Augustus seemed to sense her changed energy. During dinner, he made pointed comments about family loyalty, about how blessed they were to have each other, about how dangerous the outside world could be for people who didn't understand complex business decisions. His pale eyes never left Kathy's face as he spoke about the importance of keeping family matters private. The pharmaceutical industry faces constant criticism from people who don't understand the science behind drug development, he said, slicing his roast with the same precision he'd probably used to calculate acceptable death rates. It's easy for outsiders to second-guess decisions made by people with decades of medical expertise. Logan nodded along, but Kathy could see the strain around his eyes. He'd probably discovered some of these truths himself and had learned to rationalize them away as the price of maintaining everything their family had built. I suppose it must be difficult when treatments don't work, as hoped, Kathy said carefully, testing whether either man would acknowledge what she'd discovered. That's the nature of experimental medicine, Augustus replied smoothly. Sometimes hope is all we can offer, and hope is valuable even when outcomes aren't what we'd prefer. The euphemism was masterful. Outcomes aren't what we'd prefer instead of, we're systematically poisoning children for profit. Kathy realized she was witnessing the psychological mechanism that allowed Augustus to sleep peacefully, despite the daily evil he orchestrated. Emma chose that moment to announce her decision about the government project that had started this whole revelation. I decided to keep researching pharmaceutical regulation, even though it's complicated, she said, her 17-year-old courage shining like a beacon in the morally darkened room. Mrs. Rodriguez says the best learning happens when we push ourselves to understand difficult topics. The silence that followed felt electric with unspoken danger. Augustus's fork froze halfway to his mouth, and Logan's jaw tightened with the familiar tension of someone caught between impossible loyalties. "Emma," Augustus said finally, his voice carrying warning despite its grandfatherly tone. "Sometimes the most mature choice is recognizing when we're not ready for certain information. But I am ready, Grandpa. And if I'm going to be a doctor, I need to understand how pharmaceutical companies actually operate, not just how they say they operate." Kathy saw the exact moment when Augustus realized his granddaughter's moral clarity posed a threat to everything he'd built. Emma wasn't just researching abstract corporate malfeasance, she was unknowingly investigating her own grandfather's crimes, with the enthusiasm of someone who believed justice was possible. "Emma, I think it's time you understood something about family loyalty," Augustus said, setting down his silverware with deliberate control. "Sometimes protecting the people we love means accepting that not every question needs to be answered publicly." The room fell silent except for the quiet tick of the antique grandfather clock that had witnessed decades of Wells family meals. Kathy realized she was watching her daughter receive the same gentle indoctrination that had probably shaped Logan's conscience years earlier. But Emma had something Logan hadn't possessed at her age, a mother who was finally ready to model moral courage instead of comfortable compliance. "Actually, Emma," Kathy said, her voice surprising herself with its steadiness, "I think your project sounds fascinating. Maybe I can help you research how pharmaceutical companies interact with families who need experimental treatments." Augustus's pale eyes shifted to Kathy with the focused attention of a predator recognizing a potential threat. Logan looked stricken, probably sensing the seismic shift in family dynamics that was about to reshape everything they'd built their lives around. The transformation had begun, though none of them yet understood how completely it would change them all. That night, after Augustus had made several pointed comments about family discussions staying within the family, and Logan had retreated to his office to work late, Kathy lay awake calculating the cost of consciousness. She'd spent 15 years building a life based on willful ignorance of Augustus's true business model. Now she faced a choice that would define not only her own future, but Emma's understanding of moral courage and Logan's ability to break free from his father's psychological control. The comfortable path was obvious: destroy the evidence she'd copied, discourage Emma's research project, and return to the pleasant fiction that their wealth came from helping desperate patients rather than exploiting them. She could preserve her marriage, Emma's financial security, and the family unity that had provided stability for 2 decades. But Jennifer Martinez's voice echoed in her memory, describing Diego's unnecessary suffering and preventable death. And tomorrow, other families would receive similar diagnoses. Other children would begin treatments designed to fail. Other parents would spend their life savings on Augustus's carefully packaged false hope. Kathy realized the question wasn't whether she could expose Augustus's crimes without destroying her family. The question was whether she could live with herself if she chose family loyalty over the lives of innocent children. As dawn approached, she made a decision that would echo through the rest of her life. She picked up her phone and began searching for investigative journalists who specialized in pharmaceutical fraud. The comfortable, compliant woman who'd arranged flowers while Augustus burned incriminating documents was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that some prices were too high to pay with other people's children's lives. Chapter 2. Kathy's first attempt at confronting the truth felt clumsy and desperate, like learning to walk again after forgetting how her legs worked. 3 days after discovering Augustus's hidden files, she approached Logan in their bedroom, choosing her words as carefully as someone defusing a bomb. "Logan, I've been thinking about the foundation work, and I'm concerned about some of the families we're not helping," she began, watching his reflection in the mirror as he adjusted his tie for another day at Wells Pharmaceutical. Logan's hands stilled, and she saw his shoulders tense in the way they always did when conversations approached dangerous territory. "Kathy, the foundation helps thousands of families every year. We can't save everyone." "But what if the treatments they're buying aren't meant to save anyone? What if they're just expensive false hope?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm opening in their bedroom floor. Logan turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't recognized before, the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying unbearable knowledge for too long. "My father has spent 30 years building a company that develops medicines for the most desperate patients," Logan said, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who'd repeated the same rationalization countless times. "Sometimes experimental treatments don't work. That's the nature of cutting-edge medicine. It doesn't mean the science is wrong." His defensive tone told Kathy everything she needed to know. Logan was aware of the problems, but he'd learned to transform moral outrage into business pragmatism, the same way Augustus had probably taught him to transform childhood compassion into adult realism. "Logan, what if children are dying not from their diseases, but from the treatments themselves?" "Kathy, please." Logan's composure cracked just enough to reveal the frightened boy beneath the corporate executive. "These are complicated medical decisions made by people with expertise we don't have. Second-guessing them won't help anyone." That afternoon, Augustus requested a private meeting in his study, closing the door behind them with the ceremonial gravity of someone conducting business that required absolute confidentiality. He gestured for Kathy to sit in the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where desperate families had probably pleaded for help they'd never receive. Logan mentioned you have concerns about our pharmaceutical development, Augustus said, his voice carrying the patient tone grandparents used when explaining complex realities to confused children. I appreciate your compassionate heart, Kathy, but sometimes kindness requires understanding difficult truths. He explained, with surgical precision, how pharmaceutical companies operated in moral gray areas, how desperate patients demanded access to experimental treatments despite risks, how government regulators often moved too slowly for families facing death. He made it sound not just reasonable, but noble, a burden that good men carried for the sake of hope itself. The families we help through treatments and through the foundation, they're grateful for chances they wouldn't have otherwise, Augustus continued, his pale blue eyes fixed on Kathy's face with grandfatherly warmth. Sometimes those chances don't work out, but that's not our fault. We provide hope where there was none. Kathy listened to the seductive logic that had probably convinced Logan years earlier, recognizing how easily moral flexibility could be disguised as sophisticated understanding. But she'd read the clinical trial reports. She knew about Diego Martinez's organ failure, about the deliberately manipulated statistics, about Augustus's handwritten notes celebrating acceptable losses. This wasn't about providing hope. It was about manufacturing desperation and then selling false solutions at prices that guaranteed maximum profit before inevitable failure. I understand the complexities, Kathy said carefully, her social work training helping her maintain neutral body language despite the rage building in her chest. But I'd like to learn more about how we determine which treatments to develop. Could I review some of the research files? Augustus's grandfatherly smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation so cold it made Kathy's skin prickle with recognition of genuine danger. The research is highly technical, dear. Logan barely understands it after years of training. The dismissal was wrapped in silk, but it carried the absolute finality of someone accustomed to ending conversations when they became inconvenient. Perhaps you could focus on the foundation work, where your talents are better suited. Kathy felt the steel beneath Augustus's gentle manner, the same steel that had built an empire on children's suffering and would protect it through any means necessary. She was being warned, politely but unmistakably, to stay within the boundaries of acceptable curiosity. Her next step was reaching out to Jennifer Martinez, who was still raw with grief but eager to prevent other families from experiencing their devastation. They met at a small cafe in Hartford, 30 miles from the Wells estate, where Jennifer shared medical records, correspondence with doctors, and documentation of Diego's progression from hope through false promises to preventable death. Mrs. Wells, I've contacted 12 other families whose children were on the same treatment, Jennifer said, sliding a manila folder across the scratched Formica table. Every single child died within 8 months. The drug didn't just fail, it made them suffer more before the end. Kathy opened the folder with trembling hands, finding herself face to face with photographs of children who all shared Diego's dark eyes and brave smiles. Medical records showed the same pattern over and over, initial improvement followed by rapid systemic failure as the treatment destroyed organs faster than cancer could spread. The mathematics of cruelty were undeniable. The medication generated $40,000 per month per patient for an average of 6 months before death. Multiply by hundreds of desperate families, and Augustus's acceptable losses translated into millions in profit extracted from children's final months of life. Mrs. Wells, the worst part isn't that the medicine didn't work, Jennifer continued, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. The worst part is that it made Diego hope he was getting better when he was actually dying faster. He kept asking me why the expensive medicine that was supposed to save him was making him feel worse. I didn't know how to explain that we'd paid everything we had for poison disguised as hope. When Kathy returned home that evening, she found Augustus waiting in the foyer, still wearing his overcoat as if he'd rushed back from urgent business. Logan stood beside him, looking miserable, but resigned to whatever intervention his father had planned. "We need to talk," Augustus said, guiding her into his study and closing the door with deliberate finality. Logan remained in the hallway, excluded from a conversation about his own wife, like a child sent from the room while adults handled serious matters. "I've heard you've been meeting with former patients' families," Augustus said without preamble, his grandfatherly mask replaced by the cold efficiency of someone conducting a business negotiation. "Kathy, these people are grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame. They can't understand the science behind experimental treatments." "I think they understand that their children suffered needlessly," Kathy replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Suffered needlessly." Augustus's voice sharpened like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "These children were dying anyway. We gave them a chance, which is more than anyone else was offering. If you continue encouraging these families to question medical decisions they can't comprehend, you'll create problems for everyone, including Emma's future." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Emma's college fund, her opportunities, her security, all depended on family unity and discretion. Augustus was reminding Kathy of exactly what she stood to lose if she continued pursuing dangerous truths. "I would never want to hurt Emma," Kathy said truthfully. "I know you wouldn't," Augustus replied, satisfied that he'd successfully reminded her of the stakes involved. "That's why I'm sure you'll be more careful about who you trust and what stories you choose to believe." That night, Kathy lay awake calculating the true cost of courage. Speaking out would destroy her marriage, her daughter's financial security, and her own comfortable life. Staying silent would preserve everything she'd built and guarantee that more children like Diego would die in agony while their families paid fortunes for false hope. The resistance was working exactly as Augustus intended. He'd identified her pressure points and was applying gentle but increasing force, the same way he'd probably shaped Logan's conscience over decades of small moral compromises. What Augustus didn't realize was that guilt could be more powerful than fear, and Kathy was beginning to understand that some prices were too high to pay with other people's children's lives. The breaking point came when Emma brought home a school assignment that changed everything. Her AP government class was studying corporate whistleblowing, and she'd chosen to research pharmaceutical industry corruption for her final project, the same project Augustus had tried to discourage weeks earlier. "Mom, did you know that some companies deliberately hide negative test results to get drugs approved faster?" Emma asked during breakfast. Her laptop opened to FDA corruption cases that looked disturbingly similar to the files Kathy had discovered in Augustus's computer. Augustus's coffee cup rattled against his saucer as he set it down, his pale eyes darting between Emma's screen and his daughter-in-law's face. "Emma, you shouldn't believe everything you read online. These conspiracy theories are often spread by people who don't understand how medicine actually works." But Emma had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her grandfather's sharp intellect, a combination that made her impossible to dismiss with simple authority. "It's not conspiracy theories, Grandpa. These are court documents from actual trials where companies got caught and had to pay huge fines." Emma's voice carried the patient tone teenagers used when explaining obvious truths to confused adults. Companies that knew their drugs didn't work or were dangerous, but they sold them anyway because the profits were higher than the penalties. Kathy watched Augustus struggle to maintain his composure as his own granddaughter unknowingly described his business model with the moral clarity he'd spent decades trying to eliminate from his family. The irony was suffocating. Emma's research was exposing the corruption that funded her privileged life, with the enthusiasm of someone who believed justice was not just possible, but inevitable. "Emma, these situations involve medical complexities that take years of training to understand," Augustus said, his voice carrying the authoritative finality that had ended family discussions for decades. What might look like corporate malfeasance to an outsider could actually be difficult decisions made by people trying to help desperately ill patients. But Grandpa, if children are dying from the treatment instead of the disease, how is that helping anyone? The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Kathy realized her daughter was asking exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. Emma's moral instincts were intact because she hadn't yet learned to prioritize family loyalty over innocent lives. "That's enough," Augustus snapped, his grandfatherly patience finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "I think you should choose a different topic for your project, something more appropriate for your age and understanding." Emma's eyes flashed with rebellious fire. "Why is it inappropriate to learn about pharmaceutical regulation? If I want to be a doctor, shouldn't I understand how the industry actually works?" That afternoon, while Emma was at school and Logan was safely occupied at the office, Kathy made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She called Carl Hicks, an investigative journalist whose articles on pharmaceutical fraud Emma had referenced in her research. Her voice shook as she identified herself and requested a confidential meeting to discuss concerns about experimental treatment protocols. "Mrs. Wells?" Carl's surprise was evident through the phone. "You're calling about Wells Pharmaceutical? I need to speak with someone who understands how pharmaceutical companies can manipulate clinical trials," she said carefully, her years of social work training helping her choose words that conveyed urgency without immediate liability. "Someone who knows how to protect families from treatments that don't work as advertised." They agreed to meet at the Hartford Public Library, where Kathy felt simultaneously like a spy and a criminal as she walked through the front doors carrying copies of Augustus's most damning documents in a plain manila envelope. Carl Hicks was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the intense focus of someone who'd seen too many cover-ups and developed a healthy paranoia about corporate power. When Kathy handed him the clinical trial reports, his expression shifted from skeptical curiosity to grim recognition. "Mrs. Wells, where did you get these documents?" he asked, photographing each page with practiced efficiency. "Does it matter?" "It matters because whoever compiled this evidence knew exactly what they were looking for. These aren't random documents. They're the smoking gun that proves systematic fraud spanning multiple drug trials over several years." Carl explained that he'd been investigating Wells Pharmaceutical for 2 years, but couldn't get access to internal documentation. The evidence Kathy provided would allow him to connect patterns he'd only suspected, to prove that Augustus's company was deliberately targeting desperate patient populations with expensive treatments designed to fail. "How many children have died because of these drugs?" Kathy asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Based on the clinical trial data you've shown me, probably hundreds over the past 5 years, just from the pediatric treatments. And that's not counting the adult medications or the overseas trials mentioned in these correspondence files." Carl's voice trailed off as he continued reading, but Kathy understood the implications. The scope of Augustus's crimes was potentially massive, touching thousands of families who'd trusted a grandfather's gentle demeanor and paid for that trust with their children's lives. "Mrs. Wells, if this pattern extends to their other experimental drugs for rare diseases, we could be looking at one of the largest pharmaceutical fraud cases in history," Carl said, his journalist's excitement tempered by the human cost of what they were discussing. "But I need you to understand. Exposing this will bring down enormous scrutiny on you and your family. Augustus Wells has unlimited resources and no apparent moral boundaries." The drive home took forever and no time at all. Kathy felt simultaneously exhilarated by her courage and terrified of the consequences. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, transforming from reluctant observer to active participant in bringing down the man who'd shaped her family's identity for 2 decades. Her phone rang as she pulled into their circular driveway. Augustus calling from his office with the polite tone that had become more ominous than any shouting could be. "Kathy, dear, could you come to the study when you get home? There's something we need to discuss." Her blood went cold. Had he already discovered her meeting with Carl? Was Logan waiting in the study with accusations and ultimatums? Had someone seen her at the library and reported back to Augustus's network of business associates and private investigators? Augustus was alone when she entered, standing by the fireplace where he'd burned so many incriminating documents over the years. He turned to face her with his familiar, grandfatherly smile, but she could now see the calculation behind his gentle demeanor, the same cold assessment of leverage and vulnerability that he probably applied to evaluating desperate patients. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the Foundation's work," he said, pouring himself a brandy despite the early afternoon hour. "Perhaps I was too dismissive of your concerns. After all, you have such a good heart for helping struggling families." He was laying a trap, Kathy realized, trying to draw her into admitting what she'd been doing. The technique was probably the same one he used during business negotiations. Create the illusion of concession while actually probing for weaknesses. Instead of denying her activities, she decided to test how much he actually knew. "I appreciate that, Augustus. I've been learning so much about how pharmaceutical development works. It's more complicated than I realized." "Oh? What kind of learning?" "Just research online, talking to some of the Foundation applicants about their experiences with experimental treatments. I want to better understand what families go through when they're dealing with rare diseases." Augustus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, like a mask slipping just enough to reveal the predator underneath. "Be careful about taking these families' stories at face value, Kathy. Grief can make people see conspiracies where there are simply tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control." "Of course," she agreed, matching his false warmth with her own careful neutrality, though sometimes patterns emerge that seem worth investigating further. The word investigating hung in the air between them like a declaration of war wrapped in conversational politeness. Augustus set down his brandy and moved closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he probably used during the most crucial business negotiations of his career. "Kathy, I need you to understand something very clearly. The Wells family has enemies, competitors, regulators, opportunistic lawyers, who would love to destroy what we've built over 3 generations. They don't care about truth or helping patients. They care about bringing down successful companies and enriching themselves with frivolous lawsuits." He paused, studying her face for signs of wavering like a poker player reading tells across a high-stakes table. "If someone approached you claiming to want justice for pharmaceutical patients, they would actually be using you to hurt your own family. Logan's career, Emma's future, everything we've worked for, it could all disappear because of false accusations spread by people with ulterior motives." Kathy felt the full force of Augustus's manipulation, the way he twisted genuine concern for victims into threats against her daughter, the way he portrayed accountability as family betrayal. She recognized the tactics now because she'd been susceptible to them for years, allowing herself to be shaped by his version of reality. "I would never do anything to hurt Emma or Logan," she said truthfully. "I know you wouldn't," Augustus replied, satisfied that he'd successfully reminded her of the consequences of defiance. "That's why I'm sure you'll be more careful about who you trust and what stories you choose to believe going forward." But as Kathy left his study and climbed the stairs to check on Emma's homework, she realized that her definition of protecting her family had fundamentally changed. Real protection meant ensuring that Emma grew up in a world where companies couldn't profit from children's suffering, where her mother modeled courage instead of complicity. The first empowerment peak was approaching, and Kathy was finally ready to claim her power. 3 weeks after her meeting with Carl Hicks, the revelation that shattered Kathy's remaining illusions came from the most unexpected source: Maria Santos, the Wells family's housekeeper for over 20 years. Maria had been part of the household furniture for so long that family members often forgot she was listening, which meant she'd overheard decades of conversations never intended for outside ears. Maria approached Kathy while she was arranging flowers in the front foyer, speaking in the rapid, nervous Spanish she used when extremely upset. "Señora Kathy, I need to tell you something very important. Something about Señor Augustus and the medicines that kill children." Kathy's hands stilled among the white roses she'd been arranging, their thorns suddenly seeming less sharp than the fear in Maria's voice. "What about the medicines, Maria?" "I have been keeping papers for many years, papers I found in the trash, papers left on desks when they thought no one would see." Maria's dark eyes darted toward Augustus's study, then back to Kathy's face. "I kept them because my sister's baby died from one of their medicines in Mexico 5 years ago." The world seemed to tilt as Maria explained how her nephew, Carlos, had been enrolled in a Wells Pharmaceutical clinical trial for childhood leukemia. The family had been told it was a groundbreaking treatment that could save their son's life. But Carlos had died within 3 weeks, not from cancer, but from organ failure caused by the experimental drug. Maria had been sending money to help with medical costs while working in the very house of the man responsible for her nephew's death, cleaning his study and serving his meals while carrying the secret knowledge of his crimes. "I didn't understand what the papers meant at first," Maria continued, pulling a thick manila envelope from her cleaning supply cart. "But when I saw you meeting with families, asking questions about the treatments, I knew you would understand what they say." The documents Maria had saved told a story that went far beyond anything Kathy had discovered in Augustus's computer files. Wells Pharmaceutical had been conducting illegal human experiments in developing countries for over a decade, targeting impoverished populations who couldn't afford to refuse participation or demand accountability. Children, elderly patients, pregnant women, all had been used as test subjects for drugs that would later be repackaged and sold in the United States as breakthrough treatments for wealthy families desperate enough to pay premium prices for false hope. The scope of Augustus's operation was breathtaking in its systematic cruelty. Failed drugs from overseas trials were remarketed domestically with manipulated data, while the bodies of international test subjects were buried in unmarked graves or cremated without family consent to eliminate evidence. Most damning were Augustus's handwritten notes in the margins of international mortality reports. Next to a list of children who died during a diabetes trial in Guatemala, he'd written, "Acceptable losses. Profit margin, 3 to 40%. Below a report of birth defects caused by a pregnancy supplement tested on rural Mexican women, his notation read, "Discontinue overseas. Market domestically to fertility clinics." Kathy sat in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical innovation, and felt something break inside her that could never be repaired. Not her spirit, but her last connection to the illusion that Augustus's evil could be rationalized away as complex business decisions. There was no gray area here, no sophisticated understanding that could transform child murder into compassionate medical care. Augustus Wells was a monster who'd spent decades perfecting the art of profiting from desperation, and she had been living in his house, raising her daughter with his blood money, hosting charity events funded by children's deaths across multiple continents. "Maria, why didn't you go to the police years ago?" Kathy asked, though she suspected the answer involved the same calculations of power and vulnerability that had kept her own silent for so long. "Who would believe a housekeeper against Señor Augustus? And my family in Mexico. They need the money I send. If I lose this job, my sister's other children have no food, no school." Maria's voice broke with the impossible weight of choosing between justice and survival. "But now, seeing you try to help families, maybe together we can make someone listen to the truth." That evening, Kathy called Carl Hicks from her car while parked at a grocery store, using a burner phone she'd purchased with cash like a character in a spy novel. The precautions felt surreal but necessary. She was now actively working against a man with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. "Carl, I have more evidence. Much more. But this is bigger than pharmaceutical fraud. This is international human trafficking disguised as medical research. How much bigger are we talking? Think thousands of victims across multiple countries over more than a decade. Clinical trials conducted on populations too poor to refuse participation, with mortality rates that would shut down any legitimate research program." The silence on Carl's end stretched long enough that Kathy wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood they were discussing crimes against humanity. "Mrs. Wells, what you're describing could bring down not just your father-in-law's company, but potentially expose corruption in regulatory agencies, international health organizations, and government oversight programs. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and retaliation?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to stop him from killing more children." The words surprised her with their certainty. Somewhere between discovering the first clinical trial report and holding death certificates for Maria's nephew and dozens of other children, Kathy had crossed from reluctant whistleblower to active crusader. The comfortable, complicit woman who'd arranged flowers while Augustus orchestrated mass murder was gone forever. When she returned home, Logan was waiting in their bedroom with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but something that looked like grief for the life they were about to lose. "Kathy, we need to talk." "Of course." She sat on their bed, noting how he remained standing near the door, creating physical distance that mirrored the growing emotional chasm between them. "Dad knows about your meeting with the journalist." Kathy's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady through years of social work training and crisis management. "What meeting?" "The one in Hartford 3 weeks ago, the one where you gave confidential Wells pharmaceutical documents to Carl Hicks." Logan's voice was hollow, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "Kathy, what have you done?" "I've tried to prevent more children from dying unnecessarily." "Those children were already dying. The treatments give them a chance they wouldn't have otherwise. The treatments guarantee they'll die in agony while their families go bankrupt." Kathy stood up, facing her husband across the widening gulf of their marriage. "Logan, I've seen the real clinical trial data. I know about the overseas experiments. I know about the bribes and the cover-ups and the systematic murder of children for profit. How long have you known?" Logan's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the idealistic young man she'd married 20 years earlier, before Augustus had shaped his conscience into something that could accommodate mass murder as a business strategy. "I found out 2 years ago when Dad started grooming me to take over the company. He said it was necessary for developing breakthrough treatments that larger companies wouldn't touch, that sometimes ethical shortcuts were required to help desperate patients who had nowhere else to turn." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe him. Do you think I want to know that my inheritance is built on dead children?" Logan's composure finally broke, revealing the tortured conscience he'd been carrying in silence. "But what was I supposed to do? Destroy everything our family has built? Throw away Emma's future? Send my 70-year-old father to prison for the rest of his life?" Kathy saw the tragedy clearly now. Logan wasn't evil, just weak. He'd been shaped by Augustus's manipulation from childhood, taught to equate family loyalty with moral flexibility, success with the willingness to make difficult choices that other people couldn't understand. The same psychological forces that had nearly corrupted her completely had succeeded in making Logan complicit through gradual compromise, each small moral concession preparing him for larger ones until child murder became an acceptable cost of maintaining family wealth. "Logan, we can protect Emma by stopping this before more families are destroyed. We can build something better." No. His voice turned cold, and she heard Augustus's inflexible authority in his tone. We can protect Emma by ending this investigation before it destroys our family. Dad is offering you a choice, and you need to make it tonight. What choice? Logan's silence was answer enough, but he finally spoke the words that confirmed her worst fears about how far Augustus would go to protect his empire. Publicly recant everything you've told the journalist. Admit you were grief-stricken by the Foundation work and misunderstood complex medical information. Help us discredit any story he tries to publish, and everything goes back to the way it was. And if I refuse? Logan looked at his wife, really looked at her, for what they both knew might be the last time as husband and wife. Then you'll lose everything that matters to you. Emma's college fund, our home, your place in this family. Dad has resources you can't imagine, and patience you've never tested. He'll destroy your credibility, your reputation, and your access to Emma if that's what it takes to protect what we've built. After Logan left to spend the night at his father's house, choosing sides in a way that would define the rest of their marriage, Kathy sat alone in their bedroom and faced the hardest truth of all. There was no path back to ignorance, no way to unknow what she'd learned, no possibility of returning to complicit comfort. Augustus had forced her to choose between preserving her old life and claiming her authentic self. For the first time since this began, the choice felt not just clear, but inevitable. This courageous mother's story is hitting me right in the heart, and I'm sure it's affecting you too. If you're finding strength in Kathy's journey, please subscribe and let us know in the comments about a time you had to choose between what was easy and what was right. Your stories matter, and they inspire everyone in our Weathered Rose community. Chapter 3. The consequences of Kathy's refusal came swiftly and systematically, orchestrated with the precision Augustus applied to destroying his pharmaceutical competitors. Within 48 hours of her defiance, her carefully constructed world began collapsing piece by piece, like a controlled demolition designed to leave her with nothing but surrender. First, Logan filed for separation, moving out of their home and taking Emma with him to Augustus's estate. The legal papers cited irreconcilable differences and concerning behavioral changes that painted Kathy as an unstable wife, having a midlife crisis rather than a mother trying to prevent child murder. Augustus's lawyers had crafted the narrative carefully, portraying her investigation as delusional obsession with conspiracy theories rather than moral courage in the face of documented evidence. Every phone call to Carl Hicks became erratic behavior. Every meeting with affected families became proof of declining mental health. Emma's departure cut deepest. Her 17-year-old daughter, who'd always been her closest ally, now looked at her with confusion and resentment during their supervised visits, conducted in neutral locations under the watchful eye of Logan's attorney. "Mom, why are you trying to destroy our family?" Emma asked during an awkward lunch at a chain restaurant, with Logan's lawyer present to monitor every word of their conversation. "Grandpa explained that you're going through something difficult, but why does it have to hurt Dad and me?" Kathy wanted to explain about Diego Martinez and Maria's nephew Carlos, about the hundreds of children who died so Emma could attend elite schools and plan for Ivy League universities without financial concerns. But family court orders prevented her from discussing the Wells pharmaceutical investigation with Emma, ostensibly to protect the teenager from adult business matters that were causing her mother psychological distress. Augustus had manipulated the legal system perfectly, using Kathy's love for Emma as a weapon against her. Staying silent meant rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Speaking out meant being painted as a mother who'd chosen strangers' children over her own family's well-being. "Emma, I'm trying to protect people who can't protect themselves," Kathy said carefully, aware that every word was being evaluated for evidence of continued instability. "But why can't you protect them without hurting us?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Kathy realized her daughter genuinely believed that exposing Augustus's crimes was a betrayal of family rather than an act of love. The isolation deepened as mutual friends began avoiding Kathy's calls with the practiced efficiency of people who'd received clear social guidance. Augustus's influence extended throughout their country club, charity boards, and business partnerships. All the social connections that had defined Kathy's identity for 15 years. Women who'd been close friends for decades now crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations, treating Kathy like she'd contracted some social disease that might be contagious. The carefully orchestrated ostracism was designed to demonstrate exactly how much her comfortable life had depended on Augustus's approval. Sarah Stevens remained loyal, but increasingly worried as she watched her best friend's life disintegrate in real time. "Kathy, I support what you're trying to do, but you're destroying your life to fight a battle you can't win," Sarah said during one of their coffee meetings, now held at out-of-the-way diners instead of their usual upscale cafe. "Augustus has unlimited resources, political connections, and a legal team that specializes in destroying whistleblowers. What do you have besides moral certainty?" The question haunted Kathy because the answer felt pathetically inadequate. She had damning evidence and Maria's testimony, but Augustus had money, power, legal teams, and a granddaughter he was using as leverage against her conscience. Most nights, she lay awake in her empty house calculating whether her crusade was worth the destruction of everything she'd spent decades building. The financial warfare began when Augustus froze all jointly held accounts and credit cards, leaving Kathy with only her small personal savings account that contained enough money for maybe 3 months of basic expenses. The foundation salary she'd received as a family member was immediately terminated, along with her health insurance and access to the legal services that had handled routine matters for years. Suddenly, the woman who'd never worried about money was rationing groceries and considering whether she could afford the mortgage payments on their family home without Logan's income from Wells Pharmaceutical. Carl Hicks provided some hope, calling with updates about the investigation's progress, but even his enthusiasm was tempered by realistic concerns about the legal battle ahead. "Mrs. Wells, Augustus's legal team is already working to discredit your evidence and destroy your credibility," he warned during one of their clandestine meetings in parking lots and coffee shops far from the Wells family's social circles. "They're claiming the documents were stolen, that you're a disgruntled family member with mental health issues, that your motivation is revenge over marital problems rather than concern for victims." "What about Maria's evidence from the overseas trials?" "She's terrified. Augustus discovered her role and had her arrested on false immigration charges. She's been deported back to Mexico, and her family is being threatened by people who claim to work for Wells Pharmaceutical's international division." The systematic destruction of her case felt overwhelming. Augustus wasn't just fighting her accusations, he was eliminating witnesses, discrediting evidence, and isolating her from anyone who might provide support or validation. Each day brought new revelations of his reach and ruthlessness. Her car was repossessed due to loan irregularities that hadn't existed the previous month. Her credit rating was mysteriously downgraded, making it impossible to secure alternative financing. Even her longtime hairdresser canceled her appointments, claiming she was too booked to continue their 15-year professional relationship. The lowest point came during a surprise visit from Emma, who arrived at Kathy's increasingly empty house in tears after what appeared to be a confrontation with her grandfather. For a moment, Kathy hoped her daughter had finally seen through Augustus's manipulation and discovered the truth independently. "Mom, I found something in Grandpa's study," Emma said, pulling out a folder of documents that made Kathy's heart leap with desperate hope. Medical records and reports about children who died during drug trials. Kathy's excitement lasted exactly 10 seconds until Emma's next words shattered every remaining hope she'd harbored about her daughter's eventual understanding. "Grandpa said you planted these papers to manipulate me. to turn me against the family because you're angry about the divorce. He said you've been forging documents and spreading lies because you want to hurt him for supporting Dad in the separation." The crushing realization hit Kathy like a physical blow. Augustus had staged Emma's discovery, planting real evidence but framing it as Kathy's elaborate deception. Her own daughter now saw her mother's moral crusade as psychological manipulation, her courage as cruelty disguised as righteousness. "Emma, those documents are real. The children who died, the cover-ups, the systematic fraud, it's all true. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm trying to save lives and prevent more families from being destroyed by lies." "Then why won't you take the medicine Grandpa arranged for you?" Emma asked, her young face etched with worry and confusion that broke Kathy's heart completely. "He said you're sick, that there are new treatments that could help you think more clearly and remember what's really important." Augustus had convinced Emma that her mother's investigation was symptomatic of mental illness, probably early-onset dementia or stress-induced psychosis, that could be treated with pharmaceutical intervention. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Kathy that the man who'd poisoned children with false cures was now proposing to cure her inconvenient conscience with psychiatric medications. "Sweetheart, I'm not sick. I'm trying to stop your grandfather from hurting more children like the ones in those documents." "But Mom, the documents are fake. Grandpa showed me how you could have created them using his computer when he wasn't home. He has security cameras that recorded you in his study and timestamps that prove you were making copies of files you'd altered." That night, alone in her house with divorce papers on the kitchen table and Emma's confused tears echoing in her memory, Kathy faced the possibility that Augustus might actually win. He had superior resources, legal protection, and most devastatingly, he had Emma convinced that exposing his crimes was really her mother's elaborate mental breakdown. She stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd first discovered the clinical trial reports that started this nightmare, and wondered if she'd destroyed everything for nothing. The children were still dead. Augustus was still profiting from desperation, and now her own daughter saw her as the villain in a story where she'd tried so hard to be the hero. For the first time since this began, Kathy seriously considered Augustus's offer. She could recant her statements to Carl Hicks, undergo whatever treatment Augustus recommended, rebuild her relationship with Emma, and return to the comfortable ignorance that had once felt like peace. The alternative was losing everything while changing nothing, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging powerful people who had more resources, more patience, and fewer moral boundaries than their opponents could imagine. But as she held Diego Martinez's photograph, one of the few pieces of evidence Carl had allowed her to keep as motivation during the darkest moments, Kathy remembered why she'd started this impossible fight. Not for glory or revenge or even justice in some abstract sense. She'd started it because children were dying unnecessarily, and she had the power to prevent more deaths if she could find the courage to accept any personal cost. The question wasn't whether she could win against Augustus Wells. The question was whether she could live with herself if she stopped trying. The confrontation Augustus had been orchestrating came during what should have been a peaceful family dinner. An ambush disguised as reconciliation, with psychological warfare masquerading as concerned intervention. He'd invited Kathy to discuss Emma's future at the Wells estate, presenting it as a chance to rebuild their fractured family relationships and find common ground. Kathy arrived to find not just Augustus and Logan waiting in the formal dining room, but also Dr. Patricia Henley, a psychiatrist whose presence immediately clarified Augustus's true intentions. Emma sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her face pale and anxious, clearly unaware she was about to witness her mother being declared mentally incompetent. "Kathy, thank you for coming," Augustus said with his practiced grandfatherly warmth, though his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "We're all concerned about you, and Dr. Henley has some insights that might help us understand what you've been going through." Dr. Henley opened a thick file that Kathy realized contained her medical history, financial records, and detailed accounts of her erratic behavior over the past months. Someone, likely Augustus's private investigators, had been building a comprehensive case for psychological instability with the same meticulous care he'd once applied to falsifying clinical trial data. Mrs. Wells, your family has shared their concerns about your recent behavioral changes, Dr. Henley began in the condescending tone reserved for patients presumed incapable of rational thought. Paranoid ideation about pharmaceutical companies, obsessive focus on conspiracy theories, abandonment of family responsibilities, these are classic symptoms of late-onset delusional disorder, possibly triggered by stress related to aging and marital difficulties. Emma's eyes widened with fear as the psychiatrist continued describing her mother's supposed condition with clinical detachment. Logan shifted uncomfortably but remained silent, complicit in Augustus's psychological warfare through his refusal to defend the woman he'd supposedly loved for 20 years. Augustus himself watched Kathy's reaction with calculating interest, measuring how much pressure would be required to break her completely and force acceptance of his version of reality. The good news, Dr. Henley continued, is that this condition is highly treatable with the right combination of antipsychotic medications and cognitive behavioral therapy. With your family's support and proper medical intervention, you could return to normal functioning within 6 to 12 months. Kathy felt the trap closing around her with suffocating precision. Augustus had constructed a scenario where resistance to his corruption was redefined as mental illness, where seeking justice for murdered children became evidence of delusional thinking that required pharmaceutical intervention. If she continued fighting, he would have her committed and medicated into compliance, the same way he'd probably silenced other inconvenient voices over the decades. But it was Emma's terrified face that nearly broke Kathy's resolve. Her daughter believed she was watching her mother's mental breakdown, not her moral awakening. Augustus had manipulated Emma's love into a weapon against the very values Kathy was trying to protect. "What if I refuse treatment?" Kathy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from Augustus's confident demeanor. Logan finally spoke, his voice heavy with rehearsed reluctance that couldn't quite hide his relief at finding a solution that didn't require him to choose between his father and his conscience. "Then we'd have no choice but to pursue legal guardianship to protect you from making decisions that could harm yourself or others. The court would want to see evidence that you're receiving appropriate medical care." The room fell silent except for Emma's quiet crying. Kathy realized this was Augustus's masterpiece of manipulation, using her daughter's genuine concern as justification for destroying her mother's credibility and freedom. He'd found a way to make silencing a whistleblower look like compassionate family intervention for mental health. "Before I make any decisions," Kathy said carefully, "I'd like to understand exactly what Dr. Henley knows about my specific situation. Has she reviewed the evidence I discovered about Wells Pharmaceuticals' clinical trial practices?" Augustus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, like a mask slipping just enough to reveal the predator underneath. "Kathy, Dr. Henley is here to help with your health, not to indulge delusional fixations on—" "Actually," Kathy interrupted, standing and pulling a folder from her purse with hands that had stopped shaking for the first time in months, "I think Dr. Henley should see some of this evidence before diagnosing me as delusional." She placed photographs on the polished table, not the corporate documents that could be dismissed as forgeries, but personal pictures Carl Hicks had collected from grieving families around the world. Diego Martinez smiling in a hospital bed before starting Wells Pharmaceutical treatments. Carlos, Maria's nephew, playing soccer weeks before the clinical trial that destroyed his organs. Dozens of children who died not from their underlying diseases, but from Augustus's profit-driven experiments disguised as breakthrough medicine. "Dr. Henley, are these children part of my delusion?" Kathy asked, her voice growing stronger as she faced the psychiatrist directly. Are their deaths imaginary? Are their families' medical bills and bankruptcy filings hallucinations caused by my supposed mental illness? For the first time, Dr. Henley looked uncertain, glancing between the heartbreaking photographs and Augustus's increasingly rigid expression. The human faces of Augustus's victims were harder to dismiss than abstract accusations of corporate misconduct, especially when presented by someone who clearly understood the medical and legal implications of what she was alleging. Emma had stopped crying and was staring at the photographs with growing horror, her 17-year-old moral instincts recognizing the truth despite months of careful manipulation. "Mom, who are these children?" "They're children who died because your grandfather's company gave them treatments that were designed to fail," Kathy said, ignoring Augustus's sharp intake of breath and Logan's gesture for her to stop talking. "Children whose families paid everything they had for medicine that made their suffering worse before they died, while your grandfather calculated profit margins on their deaths." "That's enough!" Augustus slammed his hand on the table, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath his grandfatherly mask. "Emma, don't listen to these fabrications. Your mother is sick, and she's trying to turn you against your family with lies and manipulated evidence." But Emma was 17, not 7, and she'd inherited both her mother's moral instincts and her grandfather's sharp intelligence. She picked up one of the photographs, a little girl about 8 years old with dark eyes similar to Emma's own, and studied it with dawning understanding. "Grandpa, is this why you didn't want me researching pharmaceutical fraud for my government project?" Emma asked quietly, her voice carrying the dangerous clarity of someone who just connected dots that adults had hoped would remain forever separate. "Because I might find out about things like this?" The question hung in the air like an indictment that couldn't be dismissed with authority or manipulation. Logan looked stricken. Dr. Henley appeared genuinely confused about whose version of reality was accurate, and Augustus realized his psychological gambit was backfiring spectacularly. "Emma, I forbid you to listen to any more of these lies," Augustus said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated his family for decades. But Emma stood up, moving closer to her mother for the first time in months, her teenage courage finally overcoming months of careful indoctrination. "They're not lies, are they, Mom? You weren't having a breakdown. You were trying to stop this." The moment crystallized everything Kathy had been fighting for, not just justice for anonymous victims, but the chance to show her daughter what courage looked like when it mattered most. Augustus had gambled that Emma's love could be weaponized against her mother's principles, but he'd miscalculated the power of truth when witnessed by someone with an open heart. "Dr. Henley," Kathy said, gathering the photographs with steady hands, "I think you'll find that fighting systematic child murder is actually a sign of excellent mental health. The delusional thinking belongs to anyone who believes profit margins justify dead children or that psychological medication can cure a mother's conscience." Augustus's face had gone ashen as he watched his carefully constructed intervention collapse around him. Decades of manipulation and control were unraveling because he'd underestimated both Kathy's courage and Emma's integrity. The final battle was about to begin. And for the first time since discovering those clinical trial reports, Kathy felt like she might actually win. Emma's hand slipped into hers as they faced Augustus together. 3 generations of the Wells family finally divided along moral rather than financial lines. "Grandpa," Emma said with the devastating honesty only teenagers could manage, "I think Mom is the only one in this room who isn't crazy." Chapter 4. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent chambers as members of Congress prepared to hear testimony that would reshape pharmaceutical regulation for generations. Carl Hicks's investigative series had ignited a national firestorm, but the real breakthrough had come when Emma Wells, Augustus's own granddaughter, had provided additional evidence she'd discovered while helping her mother prepare for the most important testimony of her life. Kathy sat at the witness table, no longer the uncertain woman who'd once arranged flowers while Augustus burned incriminating documents in his fireplace. She wore a simple navy suit instead of the designer clothes Augustus's blood money had bought, and her hands were steady as she reviewed her opening statement one final time. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent chambers as members of Congress prepared to hear testimony that would reshape pharmaceutical regulation for generations. Carl Hicks's investigative series had ignited a national firestorm, but the real breakthrough had come when Emma Wells, Augustus's own granddaughter, had provided additional evidence she discovered while helping her mother prepare for the most important testimony of her life. Kathy sat at the witness table, no longer the uncertain woman who'd once arranged flowers while Augustus burned incriminating documents in his fireplace. She wore a simple navy suit instead of the designer clothes Augustus's blood money had bought, and her hands were steady as she reviewed her opening statement one final time. The transformation was complete, from complicit wife to fearless advocate, from silent enabler to the voice that would speak for hundreds of children who could no longer speak for themselves. Augustus sat in the gallery behind the pharmaceutical industry's legal team, his grandfatherly mask finally abandoned in favor of cold calculation as he watched his empire prepare to crumble. Logan sat separately with Emma, who had chosen to support her mother despite the personal cost of losing everything Augustus's wealth had provided. The family that Augustus had used as leverage against Kathy's conscience had fractured along moral lines he'd never anticipated, with his own granddaughter becoming the key witness who would seal his fate. Representative Sarah Chen, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order with unusual solemnity that reflected the gravity of the allegations about to be presented. Mrs. Wells, you've made serious allegations against Wells Pharmaceutical and its leadership. Before we examine the evidence in detail, would you like to make an opening statement? Kathy stood, feeling the weight of every family destroyed by Augustus's greed, every child who died for his profit margins, every parent who'd trusted his gentle grandfather demeanor and paid for that trust with everything they had. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd sacrificed everything for truth and discovered that some victories were worth any personal cost. Chairwoman Chen, members of Congress, I appear before you today not as Augustus Wells's daughter-in-law, but as an American citizen who accidentally discovered that a pharmaceutical company was systematically murdering children for profit, and as a mother who chose protecting innocent lives over protecting family wealth. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, but Kathy continued without wavering. She'd practiced this testimony for weeks, knowing she would have limited time to present complex evidence of international corruption to people who might be hearing these details for the first time. 5 months ago, I was a comfortable wife and mother who managed the Wells Foundation's charitable giving. I believed our family's wealth came from helping sick patients access cutting-edge treatments that larger companies wouldn't develop. She paused, letting the irony settle before continuing. Then I received a foundation application from Jennifer Martinez, whose 8-year-old son, Diego, had died after taking Wells Pharmaceuticals' pediatric cancer treatment. Kathy activated the presentation screen, showing Diego's photograph alongside clinical trial data that proved the treatment was designed to fail while maximizing profit margins. The contrast between the smiling child and the cold statistics of deliberate medical murder created visible shock throughout the hearing room. Diego Martinez died not from cancer, but from organ failure caused by a drug that Wells Pharmaceutical knew was toxic to children. The clinical trials showed 70% fatality rates within 6 months, But the company buried those results and marketed the treatment as breakthrough medicine to desperate families willing to pay $40,000 per month for false hope. She moved through the evidence methodically. Augustus's handwritten notes celebrating acceptable losses, financial records showing astronomical profit margins on failed treatments, correspondence proving systematic bribery of regulatory officials. Each revelation built on the previous one, creating an undeniable pattern of corruption that spanned decades and multiple countries. But Diego was not an isolated case, Kathy continued, her voice growing stronger as she reached the heart of her testimony. Wells Pharmaceutical has been conducting illegal human experiments in developing countries for over a decade, using impoverished children as test subjects for treatments that would later be marketed to American families at premium prices. The photograph that appeared next showed Maria's nephew Carlos playing soccer, followed by his death certificate listing organ failure at age 6. Kathy explained how Maria had documented evidence for years, waiting for someone with the courage to speak out until Augustus's intimidation tactics had forced her into hiding. Members of Congress, I want to be absolutely clear about what Wells Pharmaceutical has done, Kathy said, facing the committee directly with the moral authority of someone who'd lost everything to tell this truth. This company has not made mistakes or engaged in aggressive business practices. It has committed premeditated murder, disguised as medical innovation, targeting the most vulnerable populations, dying children whose families would pay any price for hope. She paused, letting the gravity of that accusation settle, before continuing with the evidence that would destroy Augustus forever. The documents before you represent hundreds of confirmed deaths and potentially thousands more victims across multiple countries. Augustus Wells has built a pharmaceutical empire by exploiting parental love and turning terminal diagnoses into profit opportunities while bribing regulators and silencing witnesses to maintain his operation. The climactic moment came when Representative James Morrison, a physician before entering politics, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything Kathy had endured. Mrs. Wells, you've destroyed your marriage, damaged your relationship with your daughter, and sacrificed your financial security to bring us this evidence. What do you hope to accomplish through this testimony? Kathy removed her wedding ring, the final symbol of her connection to Augustus's wealth, and placed it on the witness table with deliberate ceremony. The gesture was captured by every camera in the room, a visual representation of her complete transformation from complicit wife to fearless truth-teller. Congressman Morrison, I hope to prevent Augustus Wells from killing another child for profit. I hope to ensure that no other family loses everything paying for treatments designed to fail while enriching the people who should be healing them. She looked directly at Emma, who was crying but nodding with fierce pride in her mother's courage. Most importantly, I hope to show my daughter that her mother chose protecting innocent children over protecting family comfort, because that's the kind of person I raised her to be, and that's the kind of world I want her to inherit. The room fell silent as Kathy's words echoed through the chamber. Augustus sat frozen, probably calculating legal strategies and political connections that might still save him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The public outrage was building, and his granddaughter's support for her mother had destroyed his last emotional leverage. Chairwoman Chen's voice was thick with emotion as she responded to testimony that would reshape how Congress approached pharmaceutical oversight. Mrs. Wells, your courage in bringing this evidence forward, despite enormous personal cost and systematic intimidation, represents the highest ideals of civic duty and moral leadership. This committee will ensure that your testimony leads to comprehensive investigation and, where appropriate, criminal prosecution of everyone involved in these crimes. As Kathy left the witness table, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, complete alignment between her actions and her deepest values. Augustus Wells would face justice. The families he destroyed would receive acknowledgement and compensation. Most importantly, no more children would die for his profit margins. Emma met her in the hallway, throwing her arms around her mother with the fierce love of someone who finally understood what courage looked like when practiced rather than just discussed. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," Emma whispered, her voice thick with tears and admiration. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you were really doing." "You saw it when it mattered most," Kathy replied, holding her daughter close and feeling the profound peace that came from knowing she'd chosen correctly when the choice was hardest. That's what counts. Looking back through the hearing room windows, Kathy saw Augustus being escorted away by federal agents, his hands cuffed behind his back as photographers documented the fall of a man who'd built an empire on children's suffering. The patriarch who'd manipulated his family for decades, who'd used love as leverage and fear as control, was finally facing consequences, brought down by the daughter-in-law he'd underestimated and the granddaughter whose moral clarity he'd tried to corrupt. The transformation was complete. Kathy Wells had found her voice, claimed her power, and changed the world. 6 months after her congressional testimony, Kathy Wells stood in a small apartment overlooking Hartford Harbor, a far cry from the Wells family estate, but infinitely more peaceful. The morning light streamed through windows she'd chosen herself, illuminating furniture bought with money she'd earned through honest work at a nonprofit, helping pharmaceutical fraud victims navigate legal claims and emotional recovery. The divorce had been finalized quickly once Augustus's criminal indictments made national headlines. Logan, facing his own legal challenges as an accessory to his father's crimes, had signed away any contest to the settlement without demanding the bitter custody battle Augustus had threatened. Emma, now 18, had made her own choice about which parent represented the values she wanted to live by. She split her time between them, but had chosen to live primarily with Kathy, a decision that spoke volumes about which parent had truly protected her moral development. "Mom, the Martinez family is here," Emma called from the kitchen, where she was preparing coffee for their weekly meeting with other affected families. These gatherings had become a cornerstone of Kathy's new life, providing support, practical assistance, and emotional healing to people navigating the aftermath of pharmaceutical fraud. Jennifer Martinez entered with Diego's younger sister, Sophia, who was now thriving on a legitimate cancer treatment funded by the Victim Compensation Fund Kathy had helped establish through her testimony. The contrast between Sophia's bright energy and the haunting photographs of her deceased brother served as a daily reminder of why Kathy's sacrifice had been not just necessary, but heroic. "Mrs. Wells, I have wonderful news about the foundation," Jennifer said, pulling out official-looking documents with the excitement of someone who'd helped create something meaningful from unimaginable loss. "The board approved our application for permanent federal status. The Diego Martinez Foundation for Pharmaceutical Accountability will receive its designation next month." Emma beamed with pride as she served coffee to their guests. Her gap year from college spent helping establish the foundation, having taught her more about ethics, courage, and leadership than any classroom could provide. She'd learned that watching her mother's transformation had been more valuable than any Ivy League education Augustus's blood money could have purchased. Carl Hicks joined them via video call from Washington, where he was covering the final phases of Augustus Wells's trial. The pharmaceutical kingpin faced multiple life sentences for international drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and organized racketeering that had destroyed families across 6 countries. His empire had been completely dismantled, with assets distributed to victim compensation funds, legitimate medical research organizations, and regulatory improvements designed to prevent similar atrocities. "Kathy, I wanted you to know that the judge specifically mentioned your testimony as the turning point that made this case possible," Carl reported, with the satisfaction of a journalist who'd helped expose one of the largest corporate crime sprees in history. The regulatory changes you recommended are being implemented globally. You've literally saved thousands of future lives by choosing courage over comfort. The validation felt gratifying, but Kathy had learned that true satisfaction came from smaller, more personal victories, like Sophia Martinez's successful treatment and bright future, like Emma's fierce pride in her mother's integrity, like Maria, who had been granted asylum and was now working as a paralegal, helping other immigrant families navigate pharmaceutical injury claims. Sarah Stevens arrived as the formal meeting concluded, bringing lunch and the latest updates from their old social circle. Most of the women who'd once been Kathy's country club friends still avoided her, uncomfortable with someone who'd chosen principles over privilege and made their own moral compromises more visible. But a few had quietly reached out, asking for advice about their own ethical concerns and family secrets, inspired by Kathy's example to examine their own choices more carefully. "You know what I find fascinating?" Sarah said as they sat on Kathy's small balcony, watching Emma teach Sophia to play guitar with patience and kindness that had deepened since witnessing her mother's transformation. "You lost everything Augustus thought mattered: money, social status, family approval. But you seem happier than you've been in years." Kathy considered the observation while watching her daughter guide Sophia's small fingers on the guitar strings, noting how Emma's capacity for compassion had grown through witnessing courage rather than just comfort. "I think Augustus never understood what actually mattered," Kathy replied, feeling the profound peace that came from alignment between values and actions. He thought controlling people required controlling their fears: fear of poverty, fear of isolation, fear of losing security. But once you realize that your integrity is more important than your comfort, his power disappears completely. This story reminds me why I started Weathered Rose Stories, to celebrate women who find the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything material, but gains them everything meaningful. If Kathy's journey inspired you, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of moral courage. And I'd love to know, have you ever had to choose between comfort and conscience? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. That evening, as Emma prepared for her first day of college classes, she decided to study public health policy with the goal of preventing future pharmaceutical fraud. Kathy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this small apartment and this peaceful life. She'd lost a mansion but gained her soul. She'd sacrificed social status but earned her daughter's respect. She'd given up financial security but gained the security that came from knowing she could face any challenge with integrity intact. Most importantly, she'd learned that empowerment wasn't about what others allowed you to have. It was about what you were willing to risk for what truly mattered. Looking at Emma's proud smile as she packed textbooks purchased with scholarship money rather than blood money, Kathy knew she'd made the right choice at every crucial moment. Some prices were indeed too high to pay with other people's lives, and some victories were worth any personal cost. The woman who'd once arranged flowers while children died for profit was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from wealth or status, but from the courage to protect the vulnerable even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Thank you for joining me for Kathy's incredible story of transformation and moral courage. If her journey touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more tales of women who chose bravery over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over fear. Remember, true empowerment comes not from what we're given, but from what we're willing to sacrifice for our deepest values. Until next time, keep blooming where you're planted. Even when the ground is rocky and the weather is harsh, your courage matters more than you know.